Today is August 9th, 2026. It is the 52nd anniversary of the official resignation of our 37th president, Richard Milhouse Nixon. 52 years it's been. In the speech the previous day, he stated he would be leaving the presidency at noon tomorrow, and he would acquiesce his power to Gerald Ford, which is what he ended up doing. I am not here to lionize, pedestalize, or glorify Richard Nixon. Also, I am not here to villainize or try to delegitimize some of his actual accomplishments. For the record, he deserved what happened to him. He deserved to have to leave his presidency prematurely. I don't disagree with that. I don't have any contention about that. However, he has some real tangible reforms, and I think comparatively to some of our presidents after him, such as the Iran-Contra scandal, what's going on right now, outright corruption, outright enriching yourself using the presidency, makes Richard Nixon not look so bad in comparison. Because when you say someone's bad, you got to ask yourself compared to what? You got to have something to compare it to. What's interesting, though, this is the way I would really kind of describe Nixon's presidency in one sentence. It was an amalgamation of major diplomatic achievements, domestic reforms, and serious ethical failures. All I want to do is extrapolate his accomplishments from his abuses of power. And if you do that in an honest, transparent way, Nixon appears neither wholly heroic nor wholly villainous. I will caution you, I do like the Richard Nixon Foundation. It's interesting. It gives me a different perspective, and it gives me some good material for pondering. But they are really blithe about some of his achievements, and they don't really talk about the seriousness of Watergate. That would be sort of my cavil with it. But I would recommend that you take the time and do the due diligence to look into it just to have a more balanced view. What's interesting about Richard Nixon, despite his unpopularity today, despite his name dwindling at the bottom of many presidential polls, he won, even to this day, the biggest landslide in American history. He defeated George McGovern in 1972. Nixon received 520 votes to George McGovern's 49. The only state he lost was Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. Ironically, the president that won the largest landslide in American history, even to this day, ended up resigning and capitulating the levers of power to the only president who was never directly elected by the people, Gerald Ford. Interesting when you dissect these things. Deep Throat, who was the source for Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein at the Washington Post, he was the associate director of the FBI. Couple interesting things, and you can do with that what you will. You can put that together. You can simply say correlation doesn't equal causation, whatever term you want to use. I'm just simply giving you factual information. And that's because Spiro Agnew, who was Nixon's vice president at the time, ended up resigning in 1973 after pleading no contest to tax evasion, and this was connected to bribery payments. Now that I've got all the prerequisites out of the way, what are some of Nixon's achievements while in office? He ended the draft. Even to this day, the United States has not implemented a military draft. He ended not the war itself, but direct combat of United States troops. He actually had a pretty solid plan. Just because you start a war that's a mistake and it costs a substantial amount of money and lives doesn't mean you simply just capitulate, you take your lunch and you go home, kind of like we did in Afghanistan. You need a plan for peace, but you also need a pragmatic plan, which Richard Nixon did have. South Vietnam was funded by the United States, while North Vietnam was funded by the Soviets and China. They gave them around $1 billion a year, and that included weapons, aircraft, tanks, and so on and so forth. Nixon made an interesting statement a number of weeks ago when I was listening to one of his speeches. He stated that it wasn't the soldiers that lost the war. It was the media who was anti-war, and it was Congress who did not authorize further aid. And that has a plethora and different factors why involved. Big reason is because after Watergate, Nixon resigned, and part of the plan was if he was going to transfer the levers of power to Gerald Ford, then Nixon would have to be pardoned. And because Gerald Ford did that, and because Nixon resigned in disgrace, the Republican Party at the time had no political capital, and Congress did not want to pass anything. And as a result, and the anti-war sentiment, people were tired of the war, because it lasted 15 years. It was the longest war until Afghanistan. They lowered the amount of aid to $700 million from $1.1 billion. And then they ended the aid altogether. South Saigon fell, and then Vietnam essentially became communist. And then on the geopolitical chest of the Cold War, it fell to the Soviets and the Chinese. It is debated by historians what would have transpired, but there is a high probability Nixon would have had more political capital, considering he won the biggest landslide in American history. He could have continued to push for aid, and South Vietnam could have had more resources, more weapons, more aircraft at its disposal to continue without U.S. troops directly being involved. A few other accomplishments. He lowered the voting age to 18. Although he was a conservative, Nixon was quite liberal in many areas. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Under his tutelage, that agency was established. His main accomplishments, however, were in foreign affairs. Nixon was one of our smartest presidents when it came to geopolitical stratagems. He understood how the Russians thought, how the Soviets thought. He understood the history of China, why they were isolated from the West. That's the problem today, unpopular opinion, but we're all human, we're all equal. Let's be honest, China has its own history, has its own people. So does Japan. So does the Soviet Union. Modern-day Russia. They have reasons, psychological and historical, for why they behave. Countries are different because of a plethora of factors. The whole we're all human, we're all equal thing just isn't true. He signed the 1972 SALT Treaty. It was called SALT I, and that's short for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. In plain English, it froze the number of long-range nuclear weapons and limited missile defense sites. It meant that both countries agreed to stop building more nuclear missiles and stop trying to defend against them. The strategy during the Cold War for a duration of time was détente, which is French for easing of tensions. And of course, after SALT I was signed, and that lowered the probability of nuclear annihilation, which I think, even if you dislike the guy, can't really be argued that it's a bad thing. Jimmy Carter signed SALT II, and it was a framework, but then eventually Nixon got in there and he claimed, and I've not looked into it, so I don't know how substantial his evidence was, but he claimed that the Soviets did not adhere to the treaty, and then he started maximum pressure, and that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it's another story another day. I might make a video about Ronald Reagan in the future, because he was actually very active and very robust during the Cold War. A lot of people think, oh, he's just in office and he didn't do anything. No, I read a book a number of years ago, and I'm going to recheck it out, of his personal journal, and he was very active and he was very cognizant of what was going on during the Cold War. Whether you like the guy or not, I'm just here to be an honest broker and give everybody their balls and strikes. That's all I'm here to do. I don't get emotionally attached to politicians. If I'm going to worship someone, it's going to be God. It's not going to be a politician. That's just not the way I go about it. Another achievement Richard Nixon had was opening diplomatic ties with China. And that sewed a little bit off of them from the Soviet Union. And it allowed the United States and China to have economic cooperation, because China has been isolated for a long time, early on. And then when they fell to the communists, they were more allied with Russia. Nixon was able to create a framework of a relationship where they weren't necessarily allies, but they were able to have some cooperation between countries. And I'm all about, even if you don't like what a country does, you should at least try to have economic cooperation with them, if possible. Another thing Nixon did in 1973, despite facing major trepidation from Watergate, he airlifted weapons, not him personally, but he used the military, the Air Force, to airlift weapons to Israel during the war in a much needed time. And then that subsequently led to the oil embargo, and it led to the gasoline lines during Carter's presidency that did not end until Reagan's presidency, who preceded him. And like we see today, what happens overseas has real, tangible consequences on the economy, especially when our economy is globalized. And that's why, in my opinion, you can't claim that Richard Nixon is as bad as Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, he purposely, despite claiming to be a devout Christian, blocked Reconstruction bills from being signed. He had a distaste, and I'm not just saying for the time. I understand people were racist for the time. I get all that. But he was extremely vile and extremely racist for the time. He purposely blocked and subverted African Americans from having rights. He's not as bad as James Buchanan or Franklin Pierce, who signed the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which precipitated the Civil War. And I made a video talking about Franklin Pierce if you want to hear more about it. But I digress. All I'm trying to convey was Watergate was a real thing. It should be studied. It should be dissected. It should be analyzed. I understand why, even today, it's perceived as it is. And I do agree Nixon had to step down due to his paranoia, due to him attempting to cover up the tapes. I agree with all that. But Watergate is one part of the story. Many people don't mention the EPA, ending the Vietnam War, and all the accomplishments he had. And I will end with this. Real people in history are not Disney characters in many occasions. The more I read about people, with the exception of Andrew Johnson, who I hate even more, the less I vilify them and the less I idolize them. Not many people are white as snow or dark jet black. There is a lot of gray in between. And think about yourself. I'm sure there were times in your life where you did things that you thought were amazing. Then I'm sure there were mistakes you made that you paid for dearly. But then you balance it all out and you view yourself as a human. And that's all I'm trying to do is humanize Richard Nixon. Give him credit for his accomplishments, but also point out his failures.